So I was there from the turn of the millennium, and soon we began to see a new phenomenon, which was sort of the robo-hack, as we call them at the time. People coming in and seeking representations as part of the lobby as accredited media for online, for websites which wouldn't have a physical process. And strange to relate, there was actually a bit of some convulsions in relation to whether they should be admitted to what was a traditional media stronghold.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far it is from traditional. I would question this idea that's a shift. The format might be changing, but I think the reporting is still quite similar.
People were getting free news through other sources. There's been huge growth in Google, in Facebook, all over that sort of same 10, 12-year period. So all of these things have combined to hit the newspaper industry. Younger generation came along. They were sourcing their news through various different sources, but it didn't involve buying a newspaper.
So I sit in the middle for us, Joe. So, really simple. It's just on print journalism. So I was basically going to ask you about newspapers.
Do I read the news? Yeah, I read the news. I read it from my telephone, the internet, the odd magazine or paper.
So there's definitely a massive decline, obviously, in newspapers being sold and, their distribution. The current best estimates, say in Ireland, are kind of, we don't know whether it's 1, 2, 5 or 10 years, but that print will probably disappear. Or once, I suppose, the balance sheets gets to the point where they're losing money to an extent year on year, accountants will pull the plug. But I think that while the generation that reads newspapers will cease to read newspapers, I think websites are showing that the appetite for news, particularly since politics became interesting / horrific in the Western world, is there more than maybe ever before.
When we opened in 2002, we were printing solely the Irish Times. So since then, we came out. The Irish Times moved out here with the ambition of building a contract print business. When we were printing in our office in Fleet Street, we only printed our own title. So when we moved out, we had an ambition to set up a contract print business to generate another source of revenue. At that stage, the print business was a very lucrative business. Newspaper sales were on the up. The iPhone wasn't on the market, so newspaper sales were in very high growth mode when we moved out. Advertising was in very high growth mode. The economy was booming.
Yeah, mostly because everything that you can read in the newspapers on your phone nowadays.
The competition now is to get it all out, and you have individual journalists who regard themselves as brands in themselves, as if with no visible support, even though they're employed, and that's clearly their support. But they are marketing themselves in a way, if you like, and expecting maybe to transfer between, employers or whatever, or to develop their own, eventually become their own brand in some sort of mega structure, But they're competing with themselves to get the news out and so on. So there can be temptation to go with rumour, and we are seeing that with the, increasingly with the competition there is to just get something out there.
The ethics of journalism, and it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, and I wouldn't dare to tell you which came first, is also about the ethics of a population who are as driven by things that they're interested in, such as who a certain sports star may or may not have slept with, above the boring, mundane things as to why have a council repaved the same road 3 times in 5 years in my constituency. So there's kind of a shuffle between our desire to know, right, the stuff that we're interested in, our desire to be entertained, even by news now, right? So a significant part of, say, my political conscience was formed by comedians. In fact, more of my political understanding was formed by comedians than, say, Vincent Brown's 10 to 11 show, old school on RT1. Now we see that young people are getting their political news from a combination of comedians, things like The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, to a fella called Darren Conway and Finglas South on Twitter just being gas. TikTok now is something that people are aware of. So it's as much to do with our ethics as an audience as it is to do with the type of journalism, I guess, that's being produced.
The digital medium has given rise to, what would you call it, unchecked news. It's given rise to cheap news is giving rise to lies, fake news. We, as a credible newspaper, like many others, are trying to compete with that. You mentioned fact-checking and putting out a good story. That costs money, that costs time. There's an investment, and good credible newspapers invest in that. The Irish Times and lots of other newspapers, The Guardian, the Times in the UK, they're very credible newspapers, the Irish Independent. But they do invest in content. They generate the content. They hire the writers, they hire the journalists, the sub-editors. They do have, what would you call it, publish a digital edition.
Yeah, there's a lot more flamboyant stories online than you would read in an actual print. I would probably read either the Evening Herald or either the Sun or the Independent. Either of those three.
I expect newspapers to very gradually die out. I expect some what I would call rock pooling, whereby major titles will survive, and Sunday newspapers should survive as well, because people still like to read a Sunday newspaper and have the many sections and a TV guide for the coming week and so on. So they should be the last bastions, but probably like Sandcastle and Incoming Tide, they will all gradually wear away. And
most of my old-fashioned newspaper consumption happens at the weekends when there is some context given. So it's not just the scream of what's the latest death toll for coronavirus, but it's analysis maybe of how these viruses have increased in strength, how they spread more quickly than ever before. So one of the things that might save, I suppose, newspapers, but I don't think it will, but one of the things that might make newspapers, the death rattle, last a little bit longer is analysis rather than just having the latest thing, because they can never be first now. Newspapers can't be first. Twitter and social media is always first. It might be inaccurate, but it's first. So what newspapers need to do is give something else. I also think that newspapers aren't about the paper really, are they? They're about what they provide, which maybe for us in this context is a traditional news source for people who have values or news values that we share. They're just going to have to go somewhere else with those values.
The weekend newspapers, the Saturdays and the Sundays, they would double the sales of, probably double the sales and maybe a bit more than any other day of the week. The growth is towards the weekend. There's more content in the weekend. The newspapers invested are dear newspaper. There are so many, 10, 15, 20 cent, 30 cent more cover price. There's more magazines in them and supplements in them, and people are investing in that sort of thing. You see another source of revenue for newspapers is loose leaf inserts and things like that on papers. There will be high demand for the Saturday, Sunday papers because they're getting the readership and getting the audience.
Yes and no. They have to evolve, but the stereotypical way of printed journalism is completely changing them. It's like I said, the weekend papers is more focused where any sort of journalist who wants to keep writing print would have to be aiming for. Where your everyday journalist is going to struggle because there's so many other journalists that are available online. The one thing I wouldn't miss in a newspaper is the crosswords or the Sudoku. That's still a print thing that people like to do, that you can't get the same enjoyment on the phone.